Welcome to the Philly Prime Podcast and Mob Talk Sit Down. Big news today in the mob world. Par Funding and the LaForte brothers hit with a racketeering indictment here in Philadelphia. And Anthony Persiano, a former soldier in the Philly mob who turned cooperator, rat, if you want to call him that. That's what the guys call him. Some news about him, and it's been a while since we've heard anything about him. Two exciting things this week, and the only guy that you want to talk to about those topics is sitting right there, George Anastasia, the professor, my partner, and author, writer, you name it, he's done it. He's the jack of all spades here. Talk about it, George. Break this down for us. Unpack this suitcase first on Par Funding.
Par Funding, I mean, this is the next step, the superseding indictment, and basically charges these guys with a RICO, which is, from the looks of it, it always looked like that. This is a racketeering enterprise, and $550 million is a pretty nice chunk of change. The allegations are that these guys use mob tactics, mafia tactics, to extort, to intimidate, to put fear into people who either owed them money or to whom they were supposed to be providing money. So it's a broad 21st century kind of racketeering operation, but given especially the connections of James LaForte, who's
and we'll show you. We have a picture of the two brothers here: Joseph on the left, James on the right. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I mean, James has been identified in other documents as a member of the Gambino crime family in New York. So there's always been the background, where's the mob and all of this, and I think this indictment gets a little bit closer to any of that. The Persiano thing is a whole other story. I mean, we were checking the records on this guy. His case goes back to 2019, so that's 5 years.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that. We're going to get into that and unpack that too. But let's stay with Par Funding if we can for now. George, interesting, your former newspaper, The Inquirer, used this headline when the indictment came out the other day. Par Funding, LaForte brothers hit with racketeering charges, a charge normally used to prosecute the mob.
Yeah.
The Inquirer said that.
Right. I mean, it was, I think, by way of explanation, that Jeremy Roebuck wrote. He's a really good reporter.
Yes.
And in writing it, he said this is a RICO charge that's usually used in mob cases. Now, I think some people would argue that at the end of the day, this may in fact be a mob case. But, looking at it from what we've got so far, there are mob tactics, but there's no allegation of serious organized crime involvement in this.
Yeah. Talk about some of those mob tactics, George, that are outlined in the first indictment, then the superseding indictment, and now in this indictment. This sounds like something right out of a mob movie. Some of the things these guys threatened to do and apparently or allegedly did, according to the indictment.
Yeah, it's a throwback to maybe 20 years ago when violence was used to instill fear and intimidation. We're talking about people who were threatened to have their hands cut off, stuck in the head with a fork, shot, killed. We have a legitimate actual incident where a lawyer for the receiver in this case was assaulted and beat up on the streets in broad daylight. So, and you had different collectors going out to people allegedly sent by the LaFortes saying, you owe us this money. If you don't pay, here's what's going to happen to you.
Right. Renato Gio was one of those guys that supposedly was their strong man who traveled around the country. And they even wanted to charge the people they were collecting from for him to travel out to them to threaten them, allegedly.
Yeah, travel expenses, but, it's a business expense. I mean, this was, in one sense, a 21st century kind of story, this whole lending operation, business lending and playing off the economy, that kind of thing. But in terms of the tactics, once the money was in play, it was very much organized crime like in what they did. The other end of this investigation, the other end of the scam is they had investors who were told, invest in us, we're giving you a 10% return on your money. And it was almost a Ponzi scheme. Some original investors were getting that money back. Then all of a sudden, the money dried up. And then the feds and the SEC start to look, and here's LaForte with luxurious houses, jewelry, cars, all of those kind of things are now being confiscated. So it's a very, very broad kind of investigation in terms of what this group was doing. It's narrowly focused in that thus far, there aren't a lot of defendants.
Yeah. And George, let's show, we have a picture, a government provided picture of some of the ill-gotten gains that the LaFortes got their hands on. There's mansions, luxury cars, luxury watches, boats, businesses, apartment buildings, even a jet that they're talking about. $550 million in fraud that the government alleges Joe LaForte and his wife, Lisa McElhorn, either pocketed or got a big chunk of, along with several others. And while they're doing this, George, I talked about mob movies. The mention of cement shoes in here. I have 500 soldiers on the street behind me. I'll blow up your house or your car. I know where your daughter lives. Phone calls made to relatives, allegedly threatening, that kind of stuff. I mean, you don't see that in 2023, 2022, and now 2024. You just don't see that from the mob these days. But these guys were using those old school tactics that you're talking about to drive home their point. If you didn't pay them back, they loaned you money and you didn't pay them back at a ridiculous interest. This is what you got. You got to visit.
Yeah, and that's the question in all of this. Were these guys just mimicking what they thought organized crime would do, or what was this part of an organized crime operation? Thus far, we haven't seen any indication that in fact is what the case is. Although there's supposedly going to be some more indictments in this case. Yeah. But right now, I think it's two guys, the LaForte brothers, one of whom supposedly got mob connections, playing the role of gangsters in terms of trying to enforce and collect the ill-gotten money from this major scam that they set up. That's what it looks like.
And they weren't very good, George, because a number of witnesses have come forward to testify to the government. There's actual video and pictures from some of the locations where these threats were carried out. I think right after the beating of the lawyer, right, whose name we won't use because he's not identified. He is identified by initials in the indictments that have come out. A very prominent Center City lawyer, known by many lawyers, I'm sure, who wouldn't touch this case because they know that attorney. Stuff like that. But there's videos and there's pictures of them, and there's obviously phone records in 2024. You can track phones to anything, and it puts them right in the locations where these incidents allegedly occurred. I mean, this is like not smart stuff. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, we should point out the LaFortes have claimed they're not guilty, and they want to go to trial. Yes. I'm going to be very surprised if that happens. From what you just said, the evidence seems to be overwhelming in this case. And in addition to this, there's a tax evasion case waiting to come against John LaForte and his wife, or Joe. Which LaForte is it? That's
Joe LaForte and Lisa McElhorn, his wife. Yes.
They're facing tax evasion charges in addition. So there's a lot more to unpack in this whole situation. But the first step is this: the RICO charge, I think, turns a little more heat under the pot, so to speak, and we're going to see where that goes. But it's significant jail time if you're convicted in this.
Yeah. Well, let's go there for a little bit, George. Pretty much everybody I talk to, including people in law enforcement, state, local, federal, see this. People who know them see this and say they're already in steep trouble without the racketeering indictment and the tax evasion. They're already looking at serious stuff. Joe LaForte also facing gun charges. Right. Because when the FBI went to his house, when they first raided par funding in all his locations, they found guns in his house. He's a convicted felon from a prior fraud case out of Staten Island and North Jersey. Having said that, when you have a situation kind of like that, and you do something like this and kind of now build it up to a racketeering indictment, which I believe, from what I understand, was talked about as early as 2018 when they were first digging into this.
Sure.
Now it comes, look at the heat that puts on them. If they know anything about New York crime families, the Philadelphia crime family, by the way, has not been mentioned in here, not one word about Philadelphia. So people want to go there. I got a lot of direct messages on Instagram when we first talked about this, that the Philly guys got to be involved. There's been no mention of the Philadelphia mob in any of these documents whatsoever. The only mention, George, and I think you know about this as well, Joe Lanny up in New York, a Gambino capo, who's in trouble on his own at the Jersey Shore, allegedly got $1.2 million from James LaForte that came from par funding. You think, is that the road they may be trying to go down here?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said, James has been identified as a Gambino soldier in other documents up in New York. The question is, how deeply involved were the Gambinos, if in fact they were involved? How deeply were they involved in this $550 million fraud? Or was this just a LaForte's out operating and this is the tribute payment you got to make because I'm with that guy? There's no way of knowing the answer to any of that, but those are the kind of things you want to look at. People would say, well, how could they be operating in Philly and the Philly mob not know it? One, they set up shop in the beginning. They look like a legitimate operator. Mm-hmm. Two, the Philly crime family is not what it used to be anymore. And there are guys who I think are cocky enough, arrogant enough to figure we don't have to worry about these guys. We want to do business in their territory. We're going to come in and do it. Yeah. So all of those things kind of hang loose around all of this. And this RICO charge, I think, adds another layer. And maybe we're going to get to the bottom of some of this. The LaForte's have serious problems here.
Yeah. Interesting, George. You talk about this happening in Philadelphia. This was on 3rd Street, right off Market. Right. Their offices, by the way, which were quite swanky. I sat outside them many a day when I saw Joe LaForte with his Bentley parked out front, and he'd be outside on the phone. This is around the corner from Fox 29, where I worked, up the block from a coffee house that I know mob guys frequent. And they're right there sitting in Old City, Philadelphia, doing business. And the indictments and some of the documents have talked about how swanky the offices were because they were trying to impress investors when they brought them there. Humidors, leather chairs, bars, place to sit down and have a cocktail after work, that kind of stuff. They were living the good life. And if you saw, as we showed in the pictures before, there was some nice trimmings here, George.
Well, if you're going to run a high-level scam, you need that. That's part of the set. You want to do that. That's the impression you want to give to people. And they were apparently very good at that, at least for a while. Yeah. And then it all came apart.
Yeah. George, does this harken back for you to First Plus, the case with Nicky Scarfo Jr.? A big high-level white-collar crime scam like this, fraud scam?
It's not unlike that. And that was taking place down in Texas, but it was the same kind of thing. Quasi-legitimate, but in the end of the day, we're mobsters. Now, again, you raised that question, were those guys, other than Scarfo Jr., really mobsters? Guys try to take advantage of every kind of situation. I think the thing you have to wonder about here, Dave, is if this wasn't a mob operation, what was James LaForte's obligation to the Gambino crime family in that he was involved with this? And that 1.2 million that you mentioned earlier, maybe that was, everybody knows if you're in that organization, whatever organization you're in, and you're making cash, you got to kick up.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what that was. I mean, that seems to me it would make sense. Yeah. But in terms of $550 million, you should be kicking up a little bit more than 1.2 million. I think.
Yeah. And George, we didn't even open the envelope on the SEC investigation here. They've pretty much completed their investigation. The company and the LaForte's have agreed to let them take $290 million, I believe, to try and make some of the investors, clients, etc., whole, which I'm told that money has now started to go out. If I read correctly, some of the stories I've looked at, and some of the stories I've heard from people, that they are making people whole again. And there's probably a lot of victims and clients here that are, due to get money back. So that part of it at least seems to be resolving itself.
Yeah, it looks like the SEC jumped on this thing fairly quickly, and that probably saved a lot of money from disappearing. But again, that's the thing we talked about. The lawyer who was beaten up was working for the receiver in that SEC case. And in broad daylight, what are you thinking when you do something like that? You're not going to intimidate the SEC. Yeah, what was the point of that? Yeah. It makes absolutely no sense at all. Yet it happened, and that I think is indicative of who these two guys were from the Fed's perspective.
Yeah, and even in the resolution with the SEC, the LaForte's are getting in trouble. Example: there's a realtor in Philadelphia who's been hired by the receivership to evaluate and assess how much the LaForte's properties are worth, so that they can assign them to the money that's going to be given back to the victims, clients, etc.
Right.
They did not like the valuation that this realtor, who's a very popular guy and a name everybody would know, but he's not named in the indictment. His initials are in there, so we won't mention it. They went to him and allegedly threatened him in a very serious way to kick up the evaluation, make it higher so they could get more credit and not have to sell as many properties. I mean, and we're talking like 2021, 2022, when the SEC thing is in full gear here. Full gear. They're still doing it, allegedly.
I mean, the question is, is that audacious and are they arrogant or are they stupid? Or maybe it's a combination of the two. You don't do those kind of things, especially when it's in the midst of a full-blown investigation where you got the SEC and the FBI looking at everything you're doing. How do you think you're going to get away with that? It's crazy.
George, I remember a little warning I got through a birdie talking to me after you and I did the first stories on par funding. And we showed the offices down in Old City on 3rd Street. And we started talking about it. And a message came to me from the FBI through somebody. And they said, you and George are putting the cart before the horse. You're coming out of the barn a little too quickly. This isn't going to come together that fast. Well, I beg to differ. I think we left the barn with the horse, the cart, and everything else, and we were right on the money back then. Now, maybe you guys weren't ready to do this case and the racketeering part of it, but the bottom line is we were do our due here to point this out and that it was going on right under the mob's nose in Philadelphia.
It's one of those things where it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck and must be a duck. This was a quintessential RICO case. Yeah. Whether it was gangsters or guys posing as gangsters or guys wannabe gangsters, it still was a RICO case from the get-go. And that's
George,
what they've tried.
This is not our first rodeo. Would you agree with me on that, George? We've done this before. We know what we see in front of us.
Been around the block too many times, probably. I don't know.
Don't say that, George. Never say that. Yeah. All right, listen, we're going to transition here. And, George, this is all your reporting and your digging here. We're going to show you a picture. Anthony Persiano, who was a Philly mob soldier, inducted into the Philly crime family, and we'll get to that in a minute, who was also involved in restoring homes after Hurricane Sandy, and got into all kinds of trouble, got jammed up, wore a wire for the FBI, pleads guilty, George, back in 2019. In fact, 5 years ago this week. And here we are, George, in 2024. He has still, after he pled guilty, not been sentenced. And that's got to piss off the mob guys and anybody else who was victimized by him. Tell us what you found when you started looking into this.
Periodically, I go onto the PACER website that tracks legal cases. And earlier in the week, I went on, and he was scheduled to be sentenced on April the 2nd. And I counted up the times. That would have been 9, 10. That would have been the 11th time that they had scheduled that sentencing, beginning back in 2019. This week, they announced that has been put off, and now he's going to be sentenced supposedly in August. So that's 12 times that he's had his sentence scheduled and then rescheduled. And there's no logical reason for any of this except, well, I don't know if there is an except. It doesn't make any sense that this case is long over. His involvement in Philadelphia, he wore a wire on a lot of guys, a big drug case, and he wore a wire to his own making ceremony. We've never heard that particular wire. But, I mean, the guys that were indicted and charged and convicted in the operation that he was part of down here, they're away. Some of them are already coming back home. Yeah. There's no reason for this guy not to be sentenced unless, and this is something we talked about earlier, and he's somewhere out there in the
stratosphere.
Right. And if you look at the bail documents that he had to post, he's back in the same business. He's working as an estimator. You have a flood, you have an insurance claim. You bring an estimator in, here's what it's worth. We can fix it up for you. Give us the insurance money, we'll do it. That was part of what his scam was. Well, in bail documents, it said that's what he's doing again, somewhere out there. Now, one of the things I'm thinking is maybe he's working for the FBI somewhere else in America, and they want to keep him on the streets. That's why he's not being sentenced.
Yeah.
The other, I can't understand why it's taken 5 years. I know a lot of wise guys are pissed off, but there also were victims here in the Philadelphia area.
Yeah.
Who got
at the Jersey Shore.
Yeah.
People whose homes got destroyed in Sandy were victimized allegedly by him.
The only thing we see on the record is there was a civil case involving a $150,000 loan 2 people gave him. They've got a judgment against him, a default judgment. Right. Triple damage. It's like $459,000. But there are other people who are a lot of money. When he gets sentenced, they want to come in and do victim impact statements. That's been put off. So there's a lot of crazy questions around Anthony Persiano.
Yeah.
My fundamental question is, what was Persiano doing getting initiated into the Philadelphia mob?
Yeah.
This was a guy who worked you mentioned earlier, and that
Yeah.
the Nicky Scarfo thing down in Texas,
Yeah.
First Plus. He, Salvatore Piccolo, Sal Polillo. There was testimony, or there were documents in that case that they had been made in a secret ceremony arranged by Nicky Scarfo Sr. from jail.
Yeah.
It was a ceremony that nobody recognized. And Polillo claimed he was a made guy as a result. Piccolo and Persiano. They got made by God knows whom. The guys in Philly never recognized it. Nobody recognized it. But here it is several years later. Persiano is again at the table getting made by those Philly guys who, one, didn't like Scarfo Jr., and two, weren't that crazy about Polillo. But here's a guy who was in bed with those guys. Now he's getting in bed with the Philadelphia mob. Why was he at that table? Why was he able to get made by the Philadelphia guys, and he's there wearing a body wire? Yeah. It's one of those things that if you want to know why the Philadelphia mob has come undone, that's part of the story.
George, you talked about frustration. Let's talk about two guys who are sitting in jail right now who are frustrated by the fact that this guy isn't doing jail time. We got a picture of him, Dominic Grandi and Steve Mazzone, right there from one of our old Mob Talk episodes right there. That's Grandi on the left, obviously, Steve Mazzone on the right. Steve was the acting boss, allegedly, at one point. Dominic was a very high-ranking capo. Dominic is doing 7 years in Schuylkill, FCI. Steve is doing another 3 at least at FCI in Loretto, Pennsylvania. Those guys are sitting in jail probably wondering, like we are, and all the guys on the streets are probably wondering, why isn't Anthony Persiano in jail? And you talked about victims. If I was a victim or the people who loaned him money that he scammed, I'd be pissed off that this guy still is not sentenced. I can imagine when his name comes up, these two guys, I'm sure the veins in Stevie's neck pop, and he's all red in the face. He's so angry about it because they let this guy come into that making ceremony, both of which these two guys, according to federal documents, were at. That making ceremony was in a house in South Philadelphia back in, I think, 2017 or 2016. They got to be livid that this guy hasn't gotten punished yet.
Well, I mean, and that was the famous, and we would love to hear that tape, the making ceremony tape, where supposedly Stevie Mazzone says we got to plant the flag in Atlantic City, and he talks about all that, and the tape is running while that happens. You know, this whole Persiano situation gives fodder to the wise guys now who are out there saying the feds abuse the system. The feds let a guy go do all kind of stuff because he's a rat, because he's cooperating. And, you know, there are guys who take that argument to the extreme now and say, you know, they're damaging the good guys. Who are the good guys in all of this? There probably aren't any good guys.
Yeah.
But what's happened with Persiano and the fact that he hasn't had his day in court and justice has not yet been served reinforces that argument that the feds are no better than us in terms that they break the rules. They do whatever the hell they want to do just to get a conviction. Now, you know, that argument, it can get old really quickly. There's a lot of things on the other side of that argument that the guys making it don't want to mention or they don't give it to, you know, I'm talking about guys who do podcasts now, Dave. That's what I'm talking about.
Yes. Well, we'll say it's Joey Merlino who's picking on cooperators left and right. Yeah. Let me tell you something. Why hasn't he talked about Anthony Persiano? He ought to be the poster child for what Joey likes to scream and holler about rats can do whatever they want. This guy 5 years ago this week pled guilty, was due to be sentenced, hasn't been sentenced. He really is a prime example of what Merlino has been talking about here, because we don't know what the hell he's been doing for the last 5 years. The government knows, I'm sure, but he certainly hasn't been sentenced, and he's not sitting in jail that we know of.
No. I think from everything I've seen, you know, he's made bail and he is in a different part of the country, and he's working as a construction estimator, doing the same stuff he did when he's pulling off all these scams. That's what's so troubling about all of this. And 5 years is a long time to not get sentenced. You know, we've seen this in cases where they wait till the cooperator's case has been resolved, and then he gets sentenced. Well, the cases Persiano was involved in have all been resolved here in Philadelphia. You know, or that begs the question, is there something else? I don't think there is. And Persiano as a witness, I don't know how they could put him on the witness stand, given all the baggage he would bring. Yeah. So let's give him his day in court. I mean, I think that's a legitimate argument. And I don't want to
Absolutely.
line up behind these guys that are constantly whining about, oh, the Fed's this, oh, the Fed's that. There's a certain irony in all of this that guys complain and moan about the government doesn't play by the rules when these guys have spent their whole life not playing by the rules, and it's more complicated and more complex than they want to make it out to be. It's not just the government's bad. There's a lot of issues into all of this, but you're right. Persiano is a poster child for the point that a lot of guys have made. The government plays fast and loose, and they let a guy get away with whatever he wants to get away with.
Yeah. And listen, it's been told to me by defense attorneys who were on the case in 2018, 2019, the case over in New Jersey that got a lot of pleas. Joey
Right.
Electric Servideo got convicted. Sal Piccolo pled guilty. They all pled guilty, got jail sentences, that kind of thing. These guys, when you talk about this, Anthony Persiano invaded the inner sanctum of the mob here in Philadelphia and caught conversations, because we've only seen transcripts. We've never heard the tape. We may never hear the tape.
Yeah.
Those conversations literally include a high-ranking member of the Philadelphia mob introducing every single person who is at the table when this is taking place.
Yeah.
Name, rank, who guys are with. This guy's with this guy. That guy, he's with that guy. You're going to be with this guy. And then add injury here. You talked about it already. Stephen Mazzone afterward goes on to say, we got to get Atlantic City back. We can't let anybody, and he threw in some expletives that I won't use here, take our shit. I will use one there, right? We're not going to let them glom what we built, kind of thing. I mean, that's how embarrassing Anthony Persiano's work was to the mob in Philadelphia. I mean, he violated Omerta right in their midst.
Right as he was supposedly swearing an oath to Omerta. I mean, again, I come back to, he should have never been at that table. And you talk to some guys and they just kind of roll their eyes and shake their head. Yeah, you're right, you're right, you're right. But the fact is he was there. And I think that goes to kind of the bottom line in all of this, Dave. It's all about greed. He was supposedly a moneymaker. He had access to different scams that were going to make money. So yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. Ronnie Previty used to say that. He said, Ronnie, how did you go from staffer to Natalia Merlino? He said, well, because I always brought them an envelope. I mean, that at the end of the day, this has helped bury these guys.
Yeah.
The greed and electronic surveillance. That's the end of the Philadelphia mob.
Yeah. And I think you cited Previty. I mean, he talked about this on the witness stand that, these guys, as long as there were dollar signs in front of it, they forget all about what might or what could be. Yeah. And they think about $25K a month going in their pocket. Or they think about a big envelope at Christmas going in their pocket. There's even been some talk in past years that the Philly mob was taking money to be inducted into the Philadelphia mob as a member. 25,000 was thrown around, 35,000 was thrown around. I don't know if any of that's true, but it was out on the street. People were talking about it. Mob guys were talking about it to me out of New York. They're letting people buy their way in.
Well, that wouldn't be the first time that happened. I think Albert Anastasia did it up in New York way back in the 50s. I mean, it's, again, greed is a big motivator in this particular world. And guys that can provide money, guys that can offer money can get over a lot of different humps that way. And, Persiano is just out there doing whatever it is he's doing. And the feds are okay with it so far. There's been no effort, the best I can see, delay. Like I said, if the sentencing that's scheduled for August, it's the 12th time now that he's had a sentencing date. 12 times.
Yeah.
And it's never happened.
Well, I talked to two former Maid guys this week who were also cooperators. And after you told me about it, I played this scenario to them. How could this be put off for 5 years, 12 times? What could possibly be the explanation for this? And both of them quickly answered, he's got to be working another case. Or there's another case they're going to use him in. I don't think he's a good witness, but maybe he brings something to the table like the making ceremony tape or something else there. Both of them said there's no reason whatsoever that they could think of why 5 years would go by and 12 times the sentencing would get moved. I'd love to hear it. If there is one, U.S. Attorney's Office, FBI in Philadelphia, please tell us what it is. I'd love to hear it.
See, I like that theory that he's working something else and it's in the Fed's best interest to keep him on the streets. That makes the most sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think if there was another case to be made in Philadelphia, I think it would have been made already. And I think he's a damaged witness in terms of putting him on the stand.
Yeah. And listen, if there is another case and he is a witness in that case or provided more tape for them in another case like that, and that case gets indicted and it's a big RICO case and whatever, then that's a real answer to all the questions we've posed here today. Yeah. Hey, fellas, Dave and George, that's why we haven't sentenced them, right? And that's in our face, and I'm totally willing to take that if you wish. But the bottom line here is 5 years, it's not explained. Nobody knows what the hell's going on here.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing is that the innocent victims, the people who were scammed by him, who lost $10,000, $12,000, who had a house that was damaged, never got repaired. They paid him money, then they had to pay somebody else. Those are the real victims in all of this, separate and apart from a couple of wise guys who were pissed off. But those are the real victims in Persiano, and he's never been held accountable.
I got to tell you, George, my sources tell me that Persiano probably taught him a little bit of a lesson here, that this business that we're talking about, the restoration business, the repair business, is a very lucrative field. Involves insurance companies, estimators, assessors, all that kind of stuff. And that ground, from putting a roof on to rebuilding a house, that's fertile ground right there for those guys, because it's big money and they can make big money. And I've actually heard that some of them are actually in that business, that they'll tell you they're doing it legitimately. And I'm not saying they're not, but maybe he opened a window for them, or he shined a light on an area they weren't really interested in or had made any inroads in, and maybe now they are.
Well, that was certainly part of the First Plus operation up here, separate and apart from Texas. And, we were always curious about why Persiano and the guys around him weren't indicted in First Plus. Could very well be he was, providing behind-the-scenes information back then. But then he just continued the protocols that he established in terms of the world of restoration. After First Plus fell apart, he was still doing that here with other companies, and it led to what we're talking about, the 2015 case and the taping and all of that. So it goes on and on and on. And I think your sources might be correct that he's out there on a street somewhere in Middle America doing the same thing again and working with the feds. We'll see.
And I do find that a little hard to believe because his picture's all over the place. I mean, if you Google Anthony Persiano, his picture pops up left and right, So usually when your picture's out there, you're not being used by the FBI to do any kind of undercover operation or as a mob guy or any other guy. But then again, if he's somewhere very far away from here, maybe they don't look on the internet to see who the hell he is.
Yeah, or he's using a different name from where he is. So, it's conceivable. Who knows? I mean, this is one of the great, I don't remember, I can't recall a case where somebody's gone 5 years without being sentenced. 5 years.
Yeah, usually you see it once, twice, 3 times. And usually because the person is going to appear again, possibly as a witness, or may have gone to another jurisdiction to testify as a witness. Phil Leonetti, for example, he didn't just testify here in Philadelphia. In fact, he testified very little here in Philadelphia. He went to New York. He went to other jurisdictions around the country, things like that. When you're being used like that, Ron Previty testified in multiple locations, I believe, as well. That's explainable. But this, we haven't heard about him in another courtroom. We haven't heard about another investigation that might involve him. We haven't heard anything. And 12 separate times over 5 years, that's, that's something to talk about, which is why we're talking about it.
It's a little bit extreme. Yes, it is.
Yeah. And the mob guys love this because they've been poking both you and me about what's going on with Persiano. How come nothing's happening to Persiano? Why isn't Persiano in jail? Etc. Well, fellas, you got your day.
It's a legitimate question.
It is. Absolutely. George, par funding, somebody said to me right before we came on here, don't take your eye off the ball there. Kind of tells me something else might be coming out of this, or they're hoping to get something else out of this.
If I had a bet, and again, it's just speculation. If there's a mob connection, I think the connection is going to go back to New York rather than Philadelphia. So maybe we're going to see something in that regard.
I would agree with you 1,000%, George. And I appreciate your time. 35 minutes of your time today, George. You're a busy fellow. It's good to have you on the show again. And thanks for coming on. I love when you come on and we talk.
All right. Take care.
George, thank you very much. That's it for Philly Prime and Mob Talk Sit Down this week, folks. Hope you enjoyed the episode and tune in. If there are any updates on par funding or the Anthony Persiano situation, we will bring it to you, and hopefully first. Thanks for listening.